Okay. Welcome everyone to the Blue Politics Discord. I'm here with Joseph Kishore, who is the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party and ran as their presidential candidate in 2020 and does a lot of work with the World Socialist Web Site. How you doing?
Good, good. How are you? I'm glad to be here.
All right, thank you. Uh, did I get everything correct with that?
Yes, you did. Yep.
Okay, good. Um, so can you tell us more about the International Committee of the Fourth International?
Sure. Well, the Socialist Equality Party in the United States is political countries in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, and groups in Latin America as well. We are the World Trotskyist movement, the Fourth International. It was founded by Leon Trotsky in 1938 to continue the fight for revolutionary Marxism, international socialism in opposition to the betrayals of Stalinism. So the Fourth International was formed in 1938, and it has continued since. The International Committee now is the leadership of the Fourth International. We published the World Socialist Web Site, as I think you indicated, wsos.org, which is our global international news organ. I'm sure that perhaps people on this call would have more questions about the specific history of the ICFI. I know that there are some questions about our attitude to different political tendencies, and I can perhaps speak in greater detail on our history and program in response to some of those questions.
All right. So why did you run for president, and do you have any ambitions on running for Congress or public office again? If so, would you associate yourself with the Democratic Party?
The Socialist Equality Party is fighting to mobilize the working class in the United States and internationally in a revolutionary movement against capitalism. We don't think that genuine change will be achieved within the framework of the existing political institutions. We run for office, and I ran for president last year because it's a political platform to fight for a program, to fight against all the political parties of the ruling class, the capitalist parties. In the United States, principally the Democrats and the Republicans. So I ran for president too, and my running mate Narisa Santa Cruz and I, in order to fight for a socialist program. In particular, over the past year, our political work was centered on the horrific development of the pandemic and the really criminal response of the ruling class to it, which I think really exemplified the nature of capitalism. So that's why we run. It's not because we think that I could be elected or that real change is going to happen within the framework of these political institutions. We may run. I may run for Congress in the future or any other seat. But whenever we run for office, that's the basic political purpose. We would certainly not run under any circumstances within the framework of the Democratic Party. The Democrats are one of the principal parties of the ruling class in the United States. It is a capitalist bourgeois party, a party of Wall Street, the military, the intelligence agencies. It no less speaks for the financial oligarchy than the Republicans do. They are representing different factions of the capitalist ruling elite, and we are opposed to both of them. We fight to mobilize the working class in a political movement against both parties, and that applies as well for our sister parties in other parts of the world.
All right. So why do you consider yourself a Trotskyist instead of a Marxist-Leninist or a Maoist? What's the dialectical or theoretical justification for the sectarian split?
Mm-hmm. Well, by Marxist-Leninist is a term that the Stalinists generally utilize to apply to themselves. and then the Maoists. The Trotskyist movement emerged out of a fight against Stalinism, and that began in the early 1920s, as in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. The central political issue in the conflict between what became Trotskyism and Stalinism was our opposition to the Stalinist theory of socialism in one country. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, under conditions of isolation, there developed within the Soviet Union a conservative nationalist bureaucracy that repudiated the fundamental perspective of the Russian Revolution itself, which was World Socialist Revolution, that socialism cannot be achieved in one country, let alone a economically backward country such as Russia. But the bureaucracy which developed in the Soviet Union, and that was led by Stalin, or Stalin became the representative of that privileged bureaucracy, turned against and ultimately developed into the most dangerous political enemy of the perspective of World Socialist Revolution. Trotsky and the left opposition fought against that and developed first the left opposition, the international left opposition, and then in the aftermath of the catastrophic defeat of the working class in Germany in 1933, moved to form the Fourth International. So that is the historical background of the conflict between Trotskyism and Stalinism. I think similar political issues are bound up with the conflict between Trotskyism and Maoism. I would say that Maoism is a variety of Stalinism. It has its own theory of socialism in one country. So the Trotskyist movement is historically opposed to that perspective. What was the second part of that question?
What is the dialectical or theoretical justification of this split? Yeah.
Well, there are fundamental political contradictions or differences. Stalinism is in its essence a repudiation of Marxism and the perspective of Marxism. And the Soviet Union, and Stalin in particular, led a really horrific and violent, what I would call political genocide, directed against all of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, a whole generation of socialist-minded intellectuals and workers, those who really formed the foundation of the Russian Revolution itself, culminating in the assassination in 1940 by a Stalinist GPU agent of Trotsky himself, one of the greatest political crimes of the 20th century. And Stalinism throughout its history, and there continues to be Stalinist tendencies today, but it has worked to subordinate the worldwide socialist movement first to the the interests of the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union itself, and also worked to subordinate working class movements to various bourgeois national movements and to imperialism itself. So there is a profound political difference between Trotskyism and Stalinism. Trotsky referred to the river of blood separating genuine Marxism from Stalinism, referring in that way to the massive, really political genocide that was carried out against socialists and Trotskyists by Stalin.
I know that revolution is quite important towards Trotskyism. Why do you believe that the decade of revolution has begun?
Well, perhaps you're referring to a statement that we wrote at the beginning of 2020, where we said the decade
yeah,
of
that's what I'm referring to.
Revolution begins. I think it comes out of an analysis of the objective situation and the crisis of capitalism. the extreme growth of social inequality, the growth of geopolitical tensions and the danger of world war, and the extreme breakdown of democratic forms of rule. In that statement, which was published before the onset of the pandemic, we pointed to the underlying historical and political developments which were producing a period of revolution. And we addressed the economic crisis, the response of the ruling class in the aftermath of the 2008 crash, the massive handout to the rich, as I said, the growing geopolitical conflicts, the growing threat of ecological catastrophe, and above all, the growth of working class opposition. And we pointed in that statement to many signs of growing working class struggle throughout the world, mass protests, strikes, demonstrations, which were expressing the growing hostility of workers to this really bankrupt social and economic system. Then the pandemic hit. And I think the experience of the past year, the whole response of the ruling class in the United States and throughout the world to this pandemic has really demonstrated the correctness of this perspective. I mean, what did the ruling class do? First of all, it downplayed the danger. Then it utilized the pandemic to hand over a massive amount of money to the rich, the bailout of Wall Street on a scale which made 2008 pale in comparison. If you look at the wealth of people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and the other billionaires, it has soared enormously under conditions of mass death and social devastation. You have the intensification of class contradictions to a point which really is profoundly destabilizing and is producing a profound political radicalization among broad masses of people. The policy of the ruling class, particularly in the United States, although this is repeated internationally, has been one which has refused to take any, and continues to refuse, to take the most basic measures to stop the spread of the pandemic. And as a result of that, you have a situation now where 4,000 people in the United States are dying every day. The death toll from this pandemic has now exceeded 400,000. I mean, it is an extraordinary political event. But I think, you know, what we have stressed is that this does not come out of nowhere. The pandemic is a natural phenomenon, but it has intersected in a society which is completely incapable of meeting the needs of the broad mass of the population. And people notice that. I mean, this has an impact. You can't have a situation where hospitals are overflowing, people are dying in the thousands every day. The rich are richer than ever without it producing social convulsions. And I think that is that we are entering, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, where in one form or another, the conditions here are repeated.
All right. What pieces of leftist theory would you recommend one begins with in order to build a foundational understanding of leftist ideology?
Well, you know, that's one could. I mean, it's a complicated question. There's so much that one can read and really has to read to understand the history of the socialist movement, and therefore to understand what has to be done today. Of course, the writings of Marx and Engels, the origins of scientific socialism, of Marxism, are still of immense relevance to a political orientation today. I think even if, you know, one reads the Communist Manifesto, and it still strikes one that it is an incredibly contemporary document describing the basic dynamics of capitalist development. Or Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific is a really foundational statement of what is scientific, that is materialist socialism, a socialism that is rooted in the material, the objective interests of a specific class in capitalist society, the working class. The writings of Lenin are so essential. What is to be done really is critical in the elaboration of the importance of revolutionary leadership. The conception that the socialist movement requires a persistent political struggle, a political struggle against all forms of bourgeois politics. The writings of Trotsky, in particular, are absolutely essential in understanding what happened in the 20th century. And without an understanding of what happened in the 20th century, one can't build a socialist movement in the 21st century. Trotsky's Revolution Betrayed is the sort of essential analysis of the social origins and character of the Stalinist bureaucracy. His History of the Russian Revolution is a monumental elaboration of the significance and development of the Russian Revolution. His writings on really everything. I mean, actually, to understand fascism, for example, which is a critical political issue for not only those in the United States, but really throughout the world, one has to read Trotsky's writings on Germany. There was no one who had a clear analysis and made a more urgent warning about the character of Nazism, of fascism, and what it would bring about than Trotsky did. But I would say that if you want to understand our movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International, which is the continuity of Trotskyism and revolutionary socialist internationalism, there is the World Socialist Web Site. Every day we publish news and analysis from a socialist perspective, analyzing every significant political development, as well as cultural commentary. There's a number of books that I might recommend. I think perhaps one, if you would want an introduction both to the perspective of our movement, as well as the history of the socialist movement, is a book by David North called The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century. It's available on Amazon as well as our publishing company, Mering Books. The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century. It has, it includes essays on the significance of what is to be done, on Lenin, on the fight against postmodernism, on scientific socialism versus postmodernism, on the nature of the trade unions, why the trade unions are hostile to socialism, how the trade unions have developed from organizations of the working class into organizations which really cannot be any longer referred to as working class organizations, organizations that are simply an arm of the corporations and the state. And it, most important, I think it explains the connection between the development of a socialist movement today and the fundamental political issues of the 20th century. That is to say, in speaking of the unfinished 20th century, David North argues that that the basic political issues that we confront, the fight against capitalism, the fight against fascism, dictatorship, world war, that these are the same issues that were confronted in the 20th century and which produced the Russian Revolution itself. So that would be a work that I would highly recommend as well for a sort of political orientation in the present.
Okay, so what is the foremost difference between those who follow left and right-wing ideologies, and is it a subjective or objective difference?
I think it's an objective difference. I mean, what does one mean by left and right-wing ideologies? I mean, they're very broad categories. I would say that genuine left politics is socialist politics, is working class politics, is a politics which is rooted in the social interests of the working class. And the objective interests of the working class. Right politics is, I would say, the politics of the ruling class, but I would include in right politics the politics of not only in the United States the Republican Party and those fascistic forces which have been cultivated and promoted within the framework of the Republican Party, and particularly by the Trump administration. I would also include the politics of the Democratic Party within the framework of right politics. I mean, the real division, I would argue it in politics, is the objective division between the social interests of the working class, the vast majority of the population which has to work for a wage, which has no ownership of the means of production, and the social interests of the capitalist class. That is, that segment is a small minority of the population which owns the means of production. Of course, Wall Street, the banks, the giant corporations. That is, the politics of the ruling class, represented by the Republicans, the Democrats. You could also say that, there is, in addition, the politics of the middle class or the upper middle class, and that takes on different forms. We in the World Socialist Web Site, we've often written about the politics of what we call the pseudo left, and that would be the politics of groups like the Democratic Socialist of America, a socialist alternative, formerly the International Socialist Organization. These are organizations which operate in the periphery of the Democratic Party, which present themselves as left or even socialist, but really serve as either internal or external auxiliary organizations of the Democratic Party itself. There's a question I know on Jacobin, so maybe we'll return to this, but the DSA, this is not a genuinely working class movement. The DSA and similar organizations represent the interests of more privileged sections of the upper middle class. And so if you want to then, so I think perhaps the categorization of left and right, it certainly has an important meaning. But I think the more basic issue is, what are the class interests represented by different politics and different ideologies? I would also include in that, another brand of politics which is important to distinguish is the politics of racial and gender identity, which we would categorize well as a form of right-wing politics, of pseudo-left politics. That is the politics that insists that the fundamental divisions in society are along the lines of race or along the lines of gender, not along the lines of class. You have, even in the aftermath of this coup attempt by Trump, efforts by the Democratic Party to insist that this is an expression of whiteness or of white privilege, rather than the expression of the interests of the financial oligarchy, the breakdown of democratic forms of rule under the impact of extreme levels of social inequality. And the politics of race and gender is aimed at obscuring the basic class issues and advancing the interests of more privileged sections of the upper middle class, competing over positions within the state, within academia, within the trade unions, within corporations. That is, fighting not for genuine social equality, but for a more equitable distribution of positions of power among different races or genders. So perhaps it's a bit of a roundabout answer to the question, but I think the basic categorization, or what really characterizes politics or ideologies, is the social and class interests that they serve. And genuine left politics is socialist politics. It's politics which is rooted in the social interests of the international working class. And that's the politics that we fight for, to spearhead and develop an independent political movement in the working class, of all races, of all genders, of all nationalities.
You mentioned a question on Jacobin. Do you want to go right to that?
Sure. I mean, Jacobin is it's not formally affiliated with the Democratic Socialists of America, but I would say it's the magazine that is most closely associated with the DSA. The editors and publishers are all members of the DSA, and the Jacobin faction, or the faction of the DSA, which is associated with Jacobin, is dominant in the DSA. And as I said, the politics of Jacobin, of the DSA, is really the politics of the Democratic Party. You know, it's the politics which promoted the campaign of Bernie Sanders and claimed that Sanders' election campaign, both in 2016 and 2020, was a way to realize socialism within the framework of the Democratic Party, moving politics to the left. In 2016, Sanders backed Hillary Clinton, actually creating, in his own way, playing a very important role in creating the conditions for the election of Donald Trump, insofar as Sanders' backing of Clinton allowed Trump to posture as the anti-establishment candidate. Then in 2020, again ran, declaring that he was waging a political revolution against the establishment, only to turn around and become the most enthusiastic promoter of the election campaign of Biden, the scion of Wall Street and the political establishment. And I think the character of what Biden is now doing makes very clear that the political system is not moving to the left; it's moving to the right. He's continuously adapting to the Republican Party, even as the Republican Party, led by Trump, has sought to instigate a fascistic coup for the course of the past week, which I hope we'll be able to speak about a bit more. But the politics of Jacobin is the politics of the Democratic Party. We write a lot on Jacobin on the World Socialist Web Site because I think it exemplifies a certain style or a certain type of politics. And you have similar politics internationally, the politics of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, of Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain, a sort of a brand of pseudo-left politics. But Jacobin plays, I think, a particularly sort of insidious role. I mean, now they're campaigning to, along the lines that Biden can be pressured to the left, or that he's even moving to the left. It's been actually somewhat extraordinary that Jacobin, over the past week, has devoted a great deal of attention, and particularly Jacobin editor and publisher Bhaskar Sankara has devoted a great deal of energy towards denying that anything significant is happening in the United States, that the events of January 6th, when there was a fascistic mob incited by Trump, which stormed the Capitol and sought, as more information comes out, becomes clear, had sought to kidnap congressmen, that really nothing significant is happening. In the articles of Jacobin, you read statements to the effect that the institutions of American democracy are strong under conditions in which there is a conscious effort by the outgoing president of the United States to incite fascistic violence. And of course, he's been doing that over the course of the past year, but they insist that the institutions of American democracy are strong. Why? Because their whole perspective is that somehow social reform and even socialism is going to be achieved within the framework of these political institutions. They insist that there's no crisis of American democracy because they're opposed to the idea that there's any objective movement or objective basis for revolution, for socialist revolution. And so this is the politics of the Democratic Party. It really has nothing to do with genuine socialist politics, genuine working class politics.
You mentioned the riots at the Capitol. Do you want to go more into
that? Sure. Well, I think that we're having this event only a week after what was, well, a week and a half after what was really a sort of something of a crossing of the Rubicon moment in American politics. For the first time, you have a president who is inciting and sought to incite a fascistic coup, insurrection, aimed, and this is clearly the aim was to stop the certification of the Electoral College votes for Biden and overturn the results of the election. This didn't come out of nowhere. Throughout the course of the election, Trump repeatedly said that he would not recognize the results of the election. As far back as June 1st. Of course, I think everyone here will recall the incident in Washington where Trump mobilized the military police to beat protesters in Washington, D.C., threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act in order to deploy the military in cities throughout the United States in response to the protests against police violence. The praise for such individuals as the murderer in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Kyle Rittenhouse. The coup in Michigan, which was uncovered in October, fascistic organizations that were egged on by the president's call for the liberation of Michigan and other states, that is, the liberation of these states from any restraints on the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. This has been an agenda that has been implemented over a longer period of time, and that culminated in the events of January 6th, which I think were really extraordinary. There have also been calls in the preceding weeks by Trump allies and close Trump advisors that the president should declare martial law and nullify the election. Now, this coup, in the sort of immediate sense, failed. I think that there were certain political calculations that were driving it, calculations that included, in terms of those who were involved in it, the Republican Party as a whole. The events of January 6th were also connected to the efforts of the Republicans to create a sort of fictional narrative that the election was stolen. So the operation didn't succeed in a certain narrow sense, but what I think you have now in the United States as a product of all of this is the institutionalization of a genuine fascistic politics within the framework of official politics. You have in Congress, and it's cultivated within the framework of the Republican Party, outright fascists, in a way which is not really, has very little precedence or no precedence in American history. And that's sort of what now is, I think, part of the political reality. I think it's critical to understand. I mean, first of all, the response of the Democratic Party, the party of Wall Street and the military, is to continuously cover up for this reality and to make their own accommodations to it. It's really extraordinary. I mean, it's not surprising, but it's extraordinary that Biden's line in the aftermath of this insurrection is bipartisanship, unity. Everyone has to get together. He talked in a speech earlier last week, a week from today. He said, well, what we need is a strong Republican Party. And he's been insisting on bipartisanship. He wants to pass a coronavirus so-called stimulus bill with the support of the Republican Party. Everything is being done by the Democrats to rehabilitate and uphold this political institution. And all of American politics is going to shift even further to the right. But I think that the danger now of a real fascistic movement is very real, and that has to be fought against. But the way to fight against the growth of fascism is to recognize its connection to capitalism, to the interests of the ruling class, the financial oligarchy, over the past year in particular, the development of these movements, as I mentioned, has been very much connected to the policy in response to the pandemic. The ruling class insistence that workers have to remain on the job, that the schools have to open, even as the pandemic raged. This has created an absolute catastrophe, but the interests of the oligarchy demanded it. But those interests are ever more directly in conflict with basic democratic rights. And the ruling elite is turning ever more openly to dictatorial and authoritarian forms of rule. And that's, I think, expressed in these developments. It's not going to go away under a Biden administration. On the contrary, the far right will flourish. Biden's own reactionary politics will create the best conditions for that. And the real danger of the abolition of democratic rights and constitutional forms of rule is extreme, and the working class has to fight against them. There has to be a powerful movement developed in the working class, in the factories, in the plants, in the workplaces, against the growth of the far right, but connecting that to the development of a movement against the whole capitalist system, of which, that produced this really horrific political reality.
One of our users looked into your bid for presidency. He wants you to explain why it's a bad thing that 3 Americans hold more wealth than the bottom 50%, since he says that Elon Musk helped and lifted far more people out of poverty through his wealth than if his wealth was redistributed.
Well, I think it's self-evident, but the wealth of the capitalist ruling elite comes from the exploitation of workers. What is the source of profit? I mean, where does the vast wealth of an Elon Musk come from, or a Jeff Bezos come from? Ultimately, all wealth is a product of labor. It's produced through work, and particularly the labor of the working class, which produces all the goods and services of capitalist society. The labor of the working class, however, is expropriated through the process of exploitation in capitalist relations by the ruling class, and then distributed in various forms through the stock market. I mean, why has Elon Musk's wealth grown from like 26 billion to nearly 200 billion in the course of the past year? Is it because he's contributed so much to the development of society? No, it's because the US Federal Reserve has turned over trillions of dollars and dumped it into the stock market, sending the markets up to record highs under conditions of the most significant health catastrophe in the history of the United States, at least going back to 1918, 1919 and the Spanish flu, and the most significant economic disaster since the Great Depression. Nevertheless, the stock markets are at record highs because the Federal Reserve has simply turned on the printing presses in order to funnel money into the markets in the tune of trillions of dollars. Look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. It has increased during the course of the past year from about $4 trillion to over $7 trillion. It grew after the 2008 crisis from about 1 trillion to 4 trillion over a much longer period of time. But this has been the response of the ruling class to the pandemic and to the economic crisis. It's just to bail out the rich. And that's where Musk's money has come from. Now, where is all of that going to be paid for? One doesn't just create money, or one can, but ultimately it has to be paid for. Where is it paid for? Through the exploitation of the working class, through the increase or through cuts in wages, through speed ups, through cuts in social programs and austerity measures. All that has to be paid for. I mean, Elon Musk did not produce himself his $200 billion wealth. The wealth comes, all of wealth comes, and all of the wealth of capitalist society comes from the exploitation of the working class. Or Jeff Bezos. Where does that money come? Well, it comes through the exploitation of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of Amazon workers who distribute and make possible the operations. I mean, that is the source of the wealth of the ruling class. What we fight for is for the expropriation of the wealth exploited and created by the working class and appropriated by the ruling elite to meet social needs. But it's not just a question of redistribution of wealth; it's a question of ownership of production, of the forces of production. These giant corporations and banks should not be run in the interests of private profit and privately owned. They should be run. They should be publicly owned and run on the basis of social need. The healthcare corporations. It is obscene. It is an obscenity that the healthcare executives are richer than ever. That healthcare stocks are going up under conditions of this massive healthcare disaster. Part of the produced in part by the privatization of healthcare and the starving of resources. This is the product of capitalism, not to mention mass poverty all over the world, the threat of global warming, which is produced by the fact that there can be no coordinated scientific response to environmental change when everything is dictated by the interests of the ruling oligarchy or oligarchies throughout the world. The danger of world war. This is the product of capitalism. So we are fighting for the abolition of this really outmoded social and economic system.
What is your thoughts on President-elect Biden?
Well, I think I covered that earlier. Biden is, is the personification of the reactionary, militarist character of the Democratic Party. He has decades-long experience as a right-wing Democratic Party politician, part of the Iraq War, the abolition of the Glass-Steagall Act, which ended restraints on investment banks and helped create the speculative bubbles and the financial collapse of 2008. He sort of personifies the character of the Democratic Party. We reject the idea that a Biden administration is going to offer what they call space for social reform. Nothing of the sort. As I said already, he's trying to make an alliance with the Republican Party to run virtually a coalition, a government of national unity. Already kicking the teeth of Sanders and those on the so-called left of the Democratic Party, and making very evident that there will be no program of genuine social reform. The Democratic Party, a Biden administration, will be an administration of Wall Street and the military and the intelligence agencies.
All right, so within history, there was a bunch of historical and modern socialist nations. What did they do wrong or right?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what specifically that would be referring to, because I don't think actually it's correct to say that there have been many socialist nations, because I think you really have to examine the actual politics of different countries which may have called themselves socialist. I already referred to the experience of the Soviet Union. There's also, the experience of the sort of social democratic governments of Western Europe, Norway or Sweden, which had, more extensive social welfare programs, public education and healthcare, which has been under relentless attack over the past several decades. These were not, they were not socialist countries. They were capitalist countries with certain social reforms that were implemented in the post-war period, in particular, in an effort to contain and stop the threat of socialist revolution. Similar social programs were implemented in the United States, the New Deal, and other programs in the aftermath of World War II. But this wasn't socialism, it was social reform within the framework of capitalism. Then you have, countries like China, which is, run by the Chinese Communist Party, but has become one of the sweatshops of the world for capitalist transnational corporations. And one of the greatest concentrations of billionaires now is in China. Or you have various bourgeois, what I would define as bourgeois nationalist governments, like in Venezuela. These as well are not socialist countries; they are capitalist countries with perhaps certain industries which have been nationalized. But socialism means, what is socialism? Because I think that really gets to the question. What is socialism? Socialism, I would say, first of all, two things. First, socialism is the establishment of workers' control over the economy, democratic control of the economy on the basis of a scientific, rational plan that meets social need and not a private profit. And second, that real socialism is only possible on a world scale. And here, actually, one gets at the essence of the perspective of Trotskyism and the opposition to the perspective of socialism in one country, or to Maoism, or to Castroism in Cuba, the various forms of bourgeois nationalism throughout Latin America. The idea that socialism could be established in a single country is fundamentally wrong and reactionary, because socialism, and this goes back to the perspective I mentioned, the Communist Manifesto. Marx has a wonderful description in the Communist Manifesto of the character of capitalist globalization of the world market. And he's speaking at a time, of course, when the tendencies that are so clear to us now were at a very low, or were at a very initial stage. But already he was pointing to the fact that capitalism is a world system. The perspective of socialism is that capitalism has to be superseded, that there has to be a new society which carries forward the development of the forces of production that have developed within capitalism, but creates a new framework for them to develop further, and that one of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism is between the world economy and nation states, and that's what produces war. But the point I'm making is that real socialism requires a global economic plan, the abolition of the nation-state system, the transformation of world economy, placing it under the control of the international working class. So in that sense, I think it's not correct to say that there are socialist nations. There can't be a genuine socialism within the framework of a single country. So the perspective that we are fighting for is a world socialist revolution. That is the perspective of the Russian Revolution. That's the perspective of Marxism and the perspective carried forward in the Trotskyist movement.
Are there any aspects of the USSR or China, whether economic, social, or political, that you consider desirable or worthy of replication?
Well, I think I've sort of reviewed our attitude towards the Soviet Union and China. I mean, perhaps to take it from a somewhat different angle, though. One thing the Soviet Union did prove, in a certain sense, in spite then of the betrayals of Stalinism, was the extraordinary advance which comes from state control of production, of the abolition of private profit. There's even sort of remnants of this which remain. I mean, I spoke about China and its character. I mean, we would define China as a capitalist country, its basic sort of class character. And the Chinese Communist Party presides over that. But, history isn't sort of that simple. And actually the fact that in China, they were able to take measures, and this isn't to defend the Stalinist government in China. But the fact is that they were able to take measures that very quickly contained and almost virtually eradicated the pandemic, to the point where I think the death toll, ultimate death toll in China, was something on the order of 4,000 or 6,000, something like that, compared to 400,000 in the United States. And it does say something about, I think the legacy of the Chinese Revolution, which was a major social revolution, and the implementing of planning, despite all the distortions created by the bureaucratic apparatus and the bankrupt perspective of socialism in one country. So perhaps that addresses the question. The Trotskyist movement has, though, had a. So I think I explained our more basic attitude towards these countries.
When and why did you become a socialist, and how has your political ideology shifted in the past 20 years?
I became a socialist in 1999. So actually just over 20 years ago. So I guess then the second part of the question is that it hasn't fundamentally changed over the past 20 years, except I think my commitment to socialist politics has deepened. I joined the Socialist Equality Party in 1999. I was politically radicalized by the war in Yugoslavia. And that was under the Clinton administration. And then the subsequent events, the collapse of the dot-com bubble, the theft of the 2000 elections, then the September 11th attacks and the war on terror, the Iraq war, the criminal invasion of Iraq. I was attracted to the socialist movement and the Socialist Equality Party in particular. I think, like many people, as I was in college and growing up politically, I was becoming politically both interested and radicalized. I was hostile to, as I said, the Kosovo War. What attracted me to the socialist movement was that it didn't just have it wasn't just opposed to war or to inequality. But it had a scientific explanation for what was at the root of all the problems confronting mankind. That whether one's speaking about war or authoritarianism or environmental degradation, that these are all inequality, that these are all related to an underlying problem, which is capitalism, and that there is a social force, objectively, whose interests are antagonistic to the capitalist system, and that is the working class. So, what really attracted me to the socialist movement? It had a theory. It had a conception of both the root of the problem and then how to overcome it, and that I think. That was my introduction to socialist politics. At the time, I was reading, Marx, I was reading Trotsky, and then I was reading the history of the Fourth International produced by our movement called The Heritage We Defend, which is also a critical work to understand the history of the Trotskyist movement and the history of the 20th century, also written by David North. And I was struck by the commonality in the language that was present throughout. And it became clear to me that the Socialist Equality Party, the World Socialist Web Site, that was genuine Marxism, that was where one found the continuity in the perspective that had first elaborated by Marx of scientific socialism, of working class politics, and then developed through the Russian Revolution, and is continued today. So that was my introduction to socialism. As I said, I was attracted to the Socialist Equality Party, began reading the World Socialist Web Site, and then I joined. And I think the past 20 years have really confirmed that perspective. It has been 20 years of unending war, of growing social inequality, of the complete decay and collapse of democratic institutions. I don't think I could have thought, 20 years ago that we would have in the United States now an overt fascist movement or a president who was inciting that. But that is an expression of the real contradictions and crisis of capitalism, and the working class has to organize a fight against that. So my commitment to socialism has really developed and deepened over these past 2 decades.
So we're just coming up to the 60-minute mark. Just gonna ask you one final question.
Sure.
What piece of work are you most proud of when it comes to the World Socialist website?
Well, that's a hard question, I think, to answer. I've been writing for 20 years. We wrote, well, there was already a reference to the decade of socialist revolution begins, which I think was an important statement. In terms of recent articles, we also published an article at the beginning of this year on the lessons of the pandemic, and that was called. If you go to the World Socialist website, that's at the very top of the page still. The political lessons of the pandemic and the fight for socialism in 2021. Actually, there's a link at the top of the Discord page to my author page on the World Socialist website, and I think that includes some of what I think have been the more significant articles that I've written. An article on Elon Musk and the lessons of the Bernie Sanders campaign. A lecture that I gave on race and class. And in particular, that was part of a series of lectures and statements that we produced on the World Socialist website in response to the New York Times racialist falsification of history, the 1619 Project. And then I had a lecture as well, which is there on the history of the Russian Revolution. So that's, some of what I would be proud of. I think, though, I would just stress the World Socialist website is a collaborative project. Every day through the coordinated and collaborative work of the International Committee of the Fourth International, we publish a comprehensive analysis of world developments, of culture, of science, and it's really, I think, unlike anything else. I don't think there is another source of daily news and analysis that is anywhere close to what the World Socialist website does. You compare it to Jacobin. I mean, aside from the political differences, which I think are very, very clear, it's just in terms of the clarity of the daily coverage and analysis. There's no comparison. And if you read the record of the World Socialist website, in particular over the past year, our analysis of the pandemic, the warnings that we made, going back to February of last year, in March, calling for urgent action. Our analysis, and that was under conditions in which the death toll was at a very, very low level. Now 400,000 people are dead. Or the analysis that we made of Trump and the crisis of or crisis of American democracy over the course of the past year. The war, that I think that record has really been stood up and has been demonstrated to be absolutely correct. I didn't, that's certainly not only the product of me. That's the product of our international movement. But I think I would be very proud of that political record. So I would, perhaps just in conclusion, I would really encourage, anyone listening in on this, if you're interested in learning more about our movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International, the Socialist Equality Party, that you go to the World Socialist website now, explore our archives. We just redesigned our site to make more readily available the vast archives of our more than 20-year record of daily publication. I would encourage you to go and begin reading. And through that, you'll develop a better understanding of the perspective that we are fighting for.
All right. I'd like to thank you for coming on. This was a great AMA.
Thanks. I hope I was able to answer everyone's questions. The first AMA that I've done. It's anyway. I hope that I've answered the questions as clearly as I could. If there's anything that I was not able to ask, or if there's anyone who you have further questions, you can feel free to write to me. You can contact me on Twitter. On that author page, you can access my Twitter account. You can contact me there, or you can also just write into the World Socialist website if you have any further questions or thoughts that you'd like to have addressed.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you again. I'll make sure to have this uploaded by within a reasonable time frame. Do you want
Okay.
us to? Do you want me to like send it to you so you can like post it on your Twitter or something as well? Like,
yeah, sure,
usable?
sure. Yeah, send
All
it to
right.
me, sure.
So I
Yeah.
guess we're finished our AMA. There should be a debate night starting soon, and we'll make sure
Okay.
to get that set up. All right. See you, man.
All right. Thanks. Thanks. Good night.